Smithsonian Associates sponsored lecture, Part 4, presented by Bart D. Ehrman. Christianity's Triumph, How Faith Conquered an Empire. Constantine and the Christian Faith.
Okay, folk, let's start. We are hustling to the end. The end is near. Thank God. Okay, I've had several people ask me what it's like teaching what I teach in the Bible Belt, given who I am and what I think. Is it a problem? And the short story on that is that my view is that a university education is principally designed to teach people how to think. It's not so much about the content. You know, they're going to forget the content. But if you can train them how to think, that is really what you want to do in a university education. And of course, that has there are a lot of aspects to that, so I'm not going to go into all that. But teaching religion in the South is perfect for a university education. When I teach a large class of maybe 250 students in New Testament, teach an introduction to the New Testament, and most of these students are students who were raised in the church, who are conservative Christians, raised conservative Christians, who have a far greater commitment to the Bible than a knowledge about the Bible. And so they know what they believe about the Bible, but they don't know anything about the Bible. And when you challenge what they believe, not in a way to be in their face, I'm not in their face, I'm not trying to convince them no longer to believe in the Bible, I'm not trying to convince them to become agnostic, none of that. I'm introducing the Bible from a historical perspective rather than from a believing perspective. But I'm not presenting from an unbelieving perspective, it's just we're not doing it as a theological exercise. We're trying to see how the Bible works in its own historical context. And that means they have to look at the Bible in a different way. They don't have to agree with me, but they have to see what scholars have said about various things connected with the Bible, and it's completely unlike anything they've ever heard before. And since they're committed to their faith, and this is something that seems so contrary to the faith, they have to think. It forces them to think. And at the end of the day, I don't really care where they come out in terms of their faith. I don't care. I mean, I don't care whether they remain committed conservative evangelical Christians, or if they become liberal Christians, or if they become agnostic or Jewish or Buddhist or Hindu or anything else. I really don't care. But what I do care about is that wherever they end up, they're thoughtful. That if they're going to be a believer, I'd like them to be a thoughtful believer instead of an ignorant believer. An ignorant believer is somebody who doesn't think. So for me, a couple of people said it must be a challenge. Yeah, it's a challenge, but it's fantastic. I mean, it's absolutely great. I've got friends who teach in the Northeast, and their biggest challenge teaching the Bible is convincing anybody that it matters. And that just is not my problem. I've got lots of other problems, but that ain't one of them. Right. So let's get on with it. Constantine and the Christian faith. I wanted to devote an entire lecture to Constantine because of the widespread view that Constantine's conversion is what led to the triumph of Christianity. And it certainly was a significant conversion. My book begins with a chapter on Constantine and his conversion. And at the end, I have another chapter on Constantine. I've got two on Constantine as a Christian emperor. So I think Constantine's really important. But from what I've told you already, I think you can surmise, I don't think that the conversion is what mattered, because at the rate Christianity was growing, it was going to take over anyway. You know, unless something got in its way, and it didn't look like there was much of anything to get in its way. So, but Constantine's conversion, though, was huge. Not because it led to the triumph of Christianity per se. It was huge at the time because Constantine's conversion marked a complete turnaround of the imperial apparatus away from persecuting Christians to supporting them. That was big. It might have, if Constantine hadn't converted, my guess is one of his sons would have converted, or somebody else would have. But certainly it changed the tenor of church-state relationships because of Constantine's conversion, as we're going to see. So the way I want to get to this is to talk about Christianity and empire, the history of persecution, which was a question that was raised by somebody earlier. Christians, when they are converting people, are not always warmly received. In fact, most people are, many people are antagonistic toward Christians. So what can we say about how Christians were being persecuted? The modern myths. Many people today seem to think, in fact, I know they do think, that Christianity was declared an illegal religion. It was illegal to be a Christian in the Roman Empire. This is the myth. That Christians had to go in hiding. They couldn't openly profess their Christianity. That Christians were hanging out in the catacombs of Rome to avoid detection and making signs of the fish the whole time. And so all of that's a myth. None of that is true. Christianity was not declared illegal. One reason for that is because the Roman law was not like American law. We have federal laws. There are some things you can't do anywhere in this country because there are federal laws about it. We have federal criminal law. And enforcement of federal law is, in theory, consistent around the country. The Roman Empire did not have federal criminal law. Very, very few things were illegal throughout the entire empire. Different places had their own rules and regulations, and sometimes the Roman Senate would send out a notice saying, yeah, this is not to be allowed. But enforcement was very spotty. They didn't have anything like the National Guard they could send in to enforce like a major uprising. It wasn't like that. It was every locality had its own way of organizing things. There'd be a Roman who was in charge, but there'd be local people who would. And so there was no law that said you can't be a Christian, and most Christians could be Christian in most places most of the time. Throughout this early 300-year period, there were Christians who were born Christian, who lived Christian, who died Christian, who had no persecution whatsoever. Had no problem talking to their neighbors about their religion. Their neighbors might think they were a little weird, but it wasn't like illegal or something. They weren't thrown in jail for it. The persecutions were sporadic. They did happen, but they were sporadic, and they were not empire-wide. And so I want to talk about the history of the persecution, the actual facts, which, granted, are bad enough. In the New Testament, Christians are sometimes persecuted. Paul persecuted the Christians. Again, we don't know what he was doing. He might be just beating up people he didn't like who were Christian. I don't know. Paul himself, once he became a Christian, was persecuted. We know this from Paul's own writings, especially 2 Corinthians chapter 11. He details all the sufferings that he's experienced as a Christian missionary. And at one point he says that 5 times he suffered the 40 lashes minus 1. What is that? Well, what that is apparently in Jewish synagogues around the empire, there was corporal punishment that was administered to people who were out of line. It was thought that 40 lashes of the whip, 40 lashes of being flogged, was too extreme, and so the extreme punishment was 40 minus 1, 39 lashes. And Paul said he underwent that 5 times. So that can't be pleasant. He also says that he was beaten with rods 3 times. That was a Roman form of corporal punishment. It's not that he was breaking the law that you can't be a Christian, almost certainly it was that he was seen to be a troublemaker. And if somebody's a troublemaker, you punish them. You don't need a law. You need an administrator. You need an official. The official determines what needs to be punished and determines what the punishment will be. And so you get this in the New Testament, sometimes punishment like that. More often what you get are neighbors and family members who are kind of ticked off that you're joining this new religion, and they give you the cold shoulder or they give you a hard time. And so there's that kind of persecution in the New Testament as well. The first time you have any emperor involved with Christianity at all is the Emperor Nero in the year 64. It's an interesting story. And what's most interesting is that it comes to us not from a Christian source, but from a Roman source. This comes to us from the Roman historian Tacitus, who is writing in the year 115 of the Common Era. So he's writing 50 years later, and he's talking about the reign of the Emperor Nero. As you know, the city of Rome had a major fire that burned down a good chunk of the city. Many people were burned out of house and home. Tacitus reports that there was a rumor floating around that Nero was responsible for the fire. The idea behind the rumor was that Nero wanted to implement some architectural designs for the city, but he couldn't implement these architectural designs while the city was still standing. So he had to get rid of part of it. So he had it burned. He hired arsons to burn part of the city so he could implement these architectural designs. That was the rumor. Nero knew that people were accusing him of doing this, and he decided that he would find a scapegoat. He had to find someone else to blame. And so he blamed the Christians. And Tacitus says that the reason he could get away with blaming the Christians is because the Christians were the hatred of the human race. It's not clear. You could read the Latin either way. It could mean it's because everyone hated the Christians. They were the hatred of the human race. Or it could mean the Christians hated everyone else. But it could be read either way in the Latin. But either way, there's some hatred going on. So these are not people who are highly respected in their communities. Nero rounded up the Christians on the basis of informers, and he subjected them to horrifying punishments. He had some of them crucified in public. Some of them he had rolled in pitch and used as human torches for his gardens. Some of them he had wrapped in animal skins and set loose ravenous dogs on them. And they were killed that way. So this is very bad. This is the first imperial persecution by an emperor. Couple things to say about it. First thing, it was localized to Rome. This was not an empire-wide thing. This was happening only in the city of Rome. Second thing, this might sound a little weird at first. Christians were not being persecuted for being Christians. They were being punished for committing arson. And you say, yeah, but they didn't commit arson. Well, they probably didn't commit arson, but the charge was not, you're a Christian and that's illegal. The charge was, you committed arson. That's different. Okay, so the third thing to say is that there's no evidence that anyone else picked up on this afterwards. In other words, this did not become some kind of imperial policy or something. After this incident, Christians continued to go on in Rome and continued to thrive and so forth. But that's the first imperial persecution of Christians. There are several other persecutions in the years that follow, but I'm going to skip over some things because I want to get on to Constantine. I want to mention Decius. Decius was a Roman emperor for a short period, just under 3 years, 249 to 251. Decius was responsible for the first empire-wide action that involved Christian persecution throughout the entire empire. It's not clear if this action was intended to wipe out the Christians, but it certainly had consequences. So the deal was, Decius was living in the middle of the 3rd century, obviously, and this was an awful time for the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was suffering from economic collapse. There had been natural disasters. There were 2 breakaway states in the east and in the west. There were breakaway states. So the Roman Empire had become kind of a sliver of its former self. And there were barbarian invasions from the north. And within the imperial household, it was a time of assassination of the emperors. So this was a terrible time, and people didn't think the empire was going to survive. Decius, when he became emperor, decided that they needed the gods on their side. And so he implemented a policy that said everybody in the empire has to perform a sacrifice, an animal sacrifice, and you need a certificate showing that you've done it. The sacrifice was not to be to any particular god, just any god that you would normally sacrifice to. You need to make a sacrifice because he wants the whole empire joining in on true religion, hoping that this will satisfy the gods and that this mess of the 3rd century will be resolved. The thing is, Christians, of course, could not make the sacrifice. And so Christians were punished for not making the sacrifice. The old line was that this was implemented in order to persecute the Christians. The new line that's more widely thought today is that he was doing this for other religious reasons, namely to curry the favor of the gods. But the Christians were kind of swept up into it because they couldn't do that or refused to do that. That's the first time there's an empire-wide action that led to Christian persecution. The major persecution against the Christians did not come until the early 4th century with the reign of Diocletian. I'm going to talk more about Diocletian in a few minutes. For a variety of reasons, Diocletian in the year 303 inaugurated a systematic attempt to wipe out the Christians. In the year 303, he started passing some decrees. The first decree ordered that church buildings be destroyed and Christian scriptures be confiscated. Church buildings destroyed, Christian scriptures confiscated. Second decree, he ordered Christian clergy to be arrested and thrown in jail. Third decree, he indicated that clergy could get out of jail only if they would perform a sacrifice to pagan deities. Christian clergy had to sacrifice. Fourth decree, he actually required all Christians to perform a sacrifice on pain of punishment. Christians were punished, they were imprisoned, they were tortured, they were executed over a 10-year period. The thing to say about this, the point to emphasize about Diocletian's persecution, this is sometimes called the Great Persecution. The one thing to emphasize about it is that it was very spottily enforced. It was not enforced everywhere equally. The western part of the empire saw very little enforcement of it. So everything west of Italy, so into Western Europe, wasn't enforced very much at all. Was enforced more in the east and in some places more than ever. One other significant thing that happened during this persecution that Diocletian began, he wasn't emperor this entire time, but he began the Diocletianic persecution, the Great Persecution. One other thing that happened is that near its end, one of the emperors converted. And that was the Emperor Constantine. So, during this period, while Christians are being persecuted, it is interesting and not surprising, I suppose, that Christians were pleading that the state apparatus leave them alone. Christian thinkers started saying that the state has no business trying to determine what a person's personal religion is. That, in effect, these Christian thinkers were arguing in public that there should be a separation of church and state. This is the first time, to my knowledge, this is the first time in history that anybody argued for a separation of church and state. The Christians argued that until the state became Christian. The argument completely disappeared until the Enlightenment. So our modern concept of separation of church and state is from modern times, and the Christian pleas got nowhere. The Emperor Constantine. Okay, so let me tell you some things about the Emperor Constantine. First of all, background, upbringing. Constantine was born probably in the year 273 CE. He was born in the northern Balkans and was raised there. His father was a man named Constantius. Constantius was a very important figure that I'm going to talk about more in a few minutes. He was a military leader, and he became a major figure in the empire, Constantius. His mother was Hellena. People have heard of Hellena because she later in life became a Christian. There is some question about whether Hellena or Constantius were Christian before Constantine converted. Some people have the idea that Hellena maybe helped Constantine decide to convert, but that doesn't appear to be the case. The ancient accounts of his conversion don't say anything about Hellena having anything to do with it. It's more likely that she converted after he did. His early life we're not well informed about, except he started out as an army brat and became himself an army guy, and his father was a very prominent person in the army, and he also was raised then in the army. He was raised pagan. Constantine was raised pagan. He would have worshipped the local gods, the gods of Thrace, the Thracian gods. He would have worshipped the gods of his family. He would have worshipped the gods of Rome. He was a polytheist, worshipped many gods growing up. A major event in the history of the empire occurred in 293 CE. I mentioned Diocletian as a persecutor of the Christians later than this, and indeed that is how he's most commonly known today, as the persecutor of Christians, but in fact he was one of the great emperors of Rome in its entire history. The 3rd century, as I pointed out, was a complete disaster for the Roman world. Sometimes the 3rd century is referred to as the crisis of the 3rd century. It wasn't clear if it would survive. When Diocletian became the emperor in 284, when he became emperor, his 8 immediate predecessors on the imperial throne had each been assassinated, one after the other, whereas Diocletian ended up ruling for 20 years. He was a brilliant administrator and a very forceful and powerful personality, and he brought the empire back together, bringing effectively to the end the crisis of the 3rd century. They reincorporated the fragmented states, the satellite states. They brought them back into the empire. They took care of barbarian invasions. Things got much better. But he made a very important move in the year 293. By 293, Diocletian decided that the Roman Empire was too large to be ruled by one man. It simply was too big. And so he devised a system of rule that would involve 4 emperors ruling at the same time. These 4 emperors were located in different parts of the empire, 2 in the west, 2 in the east. And even though there were 4 of them, the concept of this rule of 4, the tetrarchy, the rule of 4, the concept was that each one of them represented all 4. So there was to be a unity among the 4. So if one of them won a war, all 4 of them claimed credit. Or if one of them did some other spectacular thing, all 4 got credit for it. So there's to be a unity of a college of 4 emperors. 2 of them were senior emperors and 2 were junior. The senior emperors were to be Augusti. And Augustus was a senior emperor, and each Augustus had a Caesar, a junior emperor. Okay? And they're located they're staying in different cities in the empire, ruling those parts, but all 4 are doing one thing at once. So it's the rule of 4. Diocletian, let me do this so east and west looks right to you. Diocletian was the emperor in the east with a Caesar, and he had a counterpart, a man named Maximian, who was in the west, who had his Caesar, and Maximian's Caesar was Constantius, Constantine's father. Okay? So, the really clever thing about this system was what was going to happen when one of the emperors retired or died. Until this point, what had always happened is a relative of the emperor became the next emperor. Normally, if the emperor had a son, the son would become the next emperor. And so the problem of the succession, the problem of who would succeed to be emperor was always a problem. It was a huge problem throughout the entire history of the empire. When Caesar Augustus, the first emperor, was the emperor. He didn't have a son, and so he's going to have his nephews, and they all got killed and died. It ended up that the only one left was his stepson, Tiberius. So when Augustus died, Tiberius became the emperor. Then when Tiberius died, he didn't have a son, and so it had to go to Gaius, who was Caligula, which wasn't good. And it kind of went from there, but it was always a relative. And if you had a son, but Diocletian thought this is crazy because the son might be terrible, right? And so why not appoint people who have some merit, who have some skill and some talent? We're wondering that still today. So the idea of this was, if an Augustus retired, or a Caesar retired, if somebody retires in the college, the senior Augustus, the one who's the most senior of the two, would choose the replacement. And so if an Augustus retires, the Caesar would rise up to be the Augustus, and there'd be a new Caesar appointed based on merit. Okay? And so then it would just go on like that. So you'd always have people who are highly qualified, who were chosen because of their skill and talent. And so it could go on forever like that, and it would be great. And it worked really well until after the first time it was implemented. And so, let me see, do I have a slide here? No, yeah. So what happened was, in 305, Domitian decided he'd had enough. He'd ruled for 20 years. He'd had enough. He was going to retire from the tetrarchy, and he convinced Maximian, his counterpart in the west, to retire with him. And so they both abdicated. Diocletian was the first Roman emperor in history to abdicate peacefully. Everyone before him either died or got executed or assassinated. So 305. Okay, so the way the system works then, Maximian and Diocletian, they abdicate. The Caesars, Constantius over here, this other fellow here, Galerius over here, become the Augusti, and they have two more who are elected, and so they both get a Caesar, and so that's fine. So the first time it works fine. Then what happens is the next year, Constantius is on his deathbed. So in 306, he's on his deathbed, and he has to appoint a successor because he's going to die soon. And instead of appointing somebody who is like a general in his army or something, he appoints his son Constantine. You're not supposed to appoint your son. The whole point is that's not how it's supposed to work. But he does it, and he dies, and Constantine then becomes the Caesar. Well, Maximian, who had abdicated, also had a son whose name was Maxentius. And Maxentius said, well, if Constantine gets to be a Caesar, I want to be a Caesar. And so he arranges for the Senate in Rome to declare him an emperor. Maxentius does. And it leads to a civil war because now the tetrarchy, the rule of 4, has become a rule of 5. Because Maxentius is ruling in Rome, and Maxentius has the rule of Italy and North Africa. And so the 4 emperors are 5, but the other 4 consider Maxentius to be a usurper. It's not how it's supposed to work. It's a long story what happens from there. I tell this story in the first chapter of my book. The basic line is that it leads to a civil war in which the others are against Maxentius, who's holed up in Rome but ruling Italy and North Africa. One of the Western emperors comes and attacks Rome and ends up losing and has to go back with his tail between his legs. The Eastern emperor attacks Rome and lays it under siege. But unfortunately, this is Galerius. Galerius, who's the senior emperor in the East now, goes to lay siege to Rome. Unfortunately, he's never been to Rome before, and he didn't realize how big it is. And so, he couldn't leave. It wasn't a very effective siege because he didn't have enough troops, and so he didn't know. And so that didn't work. So all this time, Constantine is in the West, biding his time. He's dealing with border wars, invasions from the north, the barbarian hordes, and he's taking care of business, and he's just letting everybody else fight it out until he thinks that the time is right. And in the year 312, he comes to try and take Rome from Maxentius, the usurper, and it leads to the very famous battle at the Milvian Bridge in the year 312. The march on Rome was a thing of military brilliance. Constantine actually brought his troops over the Alps to Maxentius' surprise. He brought them over the Alps and came down from the north into Italy, destroyed all of the forces that Maxentius had in northern Italy, marched on Rome. As he marched on Rome, Maxentius made two decisions, one that was very smart and one that was very dumb. The smart decision, as Constantine was drawing nearer, Maxentius had all the bridges across the river destroyed, so that there was no easy way to get across the Tiber River. So the bridges were destroyed, so they couldn't mount this kind of frontal attack on Rome. And then, for some unexplained reason, Maxentius, as Constantine got nearer and nearer, Maxentius made the decision to meet him in open battle. And he had a pontoon bridge built, a temporary pontoon bridge across the Tiber where the Milvian Bridge had been, and he took his entire army across this pontoon bridge to face Constantine in open conflict. And he got routed. But there was nowhere to go because their backs were up against the river. So they tried to escape across the pontoon bridge, and the pontoon bridge sank while Maxentius was on it. And he died. He drowned in the Tiber River. And that was it. So Constantine wins this battle at the Milvian Bridge. By doing so, Constantine acquired possession of Rome and Italy and North Africa. So now he's the ruler, he's the sole ruler of the entire West. That happened. So that was very big for the history of Rome, but it was also big for another reason. Because according to later reports, the night before the battle is when Constantine became a Christian. He dated his conversion to October 28th, 312, the night before the battle at the Milvian Bridge. So how did it happen? What was it all about? How did it happen? So, what is not disputed among scholars and among anyone else who reads the material is that Constantine claimed later that he converted because of a vision that he had. Because of a vision that he had. We're going to see in a second, we have several accounts of what happened with respect to this vision. One of the later sources is a church father named Eusebius. Eusebius is a very famous figure. It's spelled Eusebius, Eusebius. Eusebius is known as the father of church history. The father of church history because he's the first historian to write a history of Christianity's first 300 years. And we still have this church history of Eusebius. It's in 10 volumes. You can buy it in very convenient English translations. It's a wealth of material about early Christianity, told from a very biased point of view that's affected his reporting, but still, it gives us a lot of information. He also wrote a book called The Life of Constantine. Eusebius wrote a biography of the Emperor Constantine, which was useful because he actually had met Constantine and got information from Constantine. And one of the things he tells us is about his conversion, as we're going to see in a second. But what he tells us about the preparation is interesting. What Eusebius says is that as Constantine was marching on Rome, he was trying to figure out, on a religious basis, how to access the power that he needed in order to win the battle. Gods can provide things that humans cannot provide, and so you depend on the gods to provide things. And for a very empirical reason, Constantine decided that this polytheistic thing wasn't working. The two previous emperors who attacked Rome were polytheists, and the gods hadn't helped them. So maybe that's not it. Maybe he needs to find the one God who can help. And he prayed for guidance. Which God would it be? We have three accounts of a vision that Constantine had, and scholars try to figure out whether he had 3 different visions, if he had lots of different visions, if he had one vision that later reported in different ways, maybe he confused things, how to make sense of it all. So the 3 accounts. The first account is actually written by a pagan rhetorician in a kind of speech called a panegyric. A panegyric was an ancient kind of speech that was often given. We have lots of panegyrics from the ancient world. A panegyric is a speech that is praising an individual, usually praising him as the greatest human being the universe has ever seen. So there was a panegyric delivered to Constantine in the year 310. We don't know who the author of this was, but we actually have the speech. And in the speech, he indicates that while he was he was involved in some kind of battle, he was actually, this is before the Milvian Bridge, that he was in France, northern France, and he won the battle, and he was going to a temple of Apollo in order to offer his thanks for winning this battle. And he had a vision. And in this vision, Apollo appeared to him, promised him he would be the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, and handed him several laurel wreaths. Each of these laurel wreaths represented 30 years, which meant that he would have a preternaturally long life as the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. That was his vision, and on the basis of that vision, he decided that he was going to worship Apollo. Now, Apollo was sometimes thought of as the god of the sun god. And sometimes the sun god was worshipped under the title Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. And according to this panegyric, at this point, Constantine started worshiping as the only god, the unconquered sun. Okay, S-U-N, unconquered sun. Eusebius' Life of Constantine, written almost 30 years later. Eusebius tells a more familiar tale of a vision that Constantine had. Eusebius does not tell us when he had this vision. He only tells us that it was sometime while he was on a military campaign. According to Eusebius, Constantine had prayed that this one God who's most powerful will reveal himself, and he's on a march, and he had a vision. Not just he, his entire army saw this vision. In the sky was a cross, and over it was a sign that said, "By this, conquer." The vision disappeared, and Constantine had no clue what he had just seen. And so he prays to God to show him what in the world that was. And that night he has a dream, and Christ appears to him. And Christ tells him that he needs to build an image like what he had seen in the sky and take it with him into battle. The next day, he gets up, he asks his advisors what this is all about, and they explain to him who Christ is and how Christ died for his sins, and how this is saying you need to worship just Christ, and Constantine then gives directions for his goldsmiths to make this cross thing, which looks like a cross. It's made out of gold, and it's called the labarum. The labarum is this cross that at the top has a medallion thing with 2 Greek letters in it. The letter chi, which looks like an X, and the letter rho, which looks like a capital P. But the rho is actually an R in Greek. And so it's chi, rho, which are the first 2 letters of the name Christos, Christ. And so he makes this thing, according to Eusebius. He makes this labarum, takes it into the battle of the Milvian Bridge, and wins. And from then on, every battle he fought, he took the labarum, and he won every time. And whenever the enemy was shooting arrows at him, they would all lodge in the labarum instead of hitting him. And so it was great to have this labarum. And so he decided that he's going to worship only Christ at that point. So that's Eusebius' version. There was a version that was given years earlier, the third version, which is very hard to reconcile with the other 2. Lactantius. Lactantius is not a household name, the way maybe others are, but Lactantius was an important figure who personally knew Constantine. Constantine, a little bit later, he hired Lactantius to be the tutor for his own son, for his eldest son. So Lactantius worked in the imperial household. He wrote a book called Death of the Persecutors, where he talks about how every emperor who had persecuted the Christians experienced a horrible death, that God zapped them in the end. And so they always regretted persecuting the Christians. He tells about Constantine's conversion, and what he says is that the night before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge is when Constantine had a vision, and in his vision, someone showed him the symbol of Christ, the Chi-Rho, and told him, put this on the shields of your soldiers. He wakes up, has the soldiers draw the Chi-Rho on their shields, they go to battle, and they win the battle. Okay, well, is there any way to make sense of these three visions? Some people think that Constantine just had a lot of visions. He was dreaming the whole time. Maybe that's right. Some people think he had one vision, but like he told it in different ways and he didn't get the details straight and he changed his story over time. That's possible too. The real problem is there have been studies of converts in modern times. Modern scholars have studied conversion experiences. And what always happens is if somebody converts and then has a lot of experience over the next 20 years, when they remember their conversion, their experiences in the meantime affect how they remember the conversion. And so you change the story in your own head without knowing you're doing that. And so it's not quite clear if Constantine changed the story in his head and not knowing he did it or what. But my best guess is that something like this happened. My best guess is that in 310, he did have this vision. He had some idea of Apollo. And at that point, he became a henotheist. In 310, he stopped worshiping many gods and started worshiping Apollo, the unconquered sun, Sol Invictus. And then, while marching on Rome, he had another vision, and in this second vision, it's not that he decided to stop worshiping Sol Invictus and start worshiping the God of Jesus, the God of Christ. It's not that. It's that he came to think that Sol Invictus was the God of Christ. That the God of Christ was the unconquered Son. That now he realized who this God is. It's the Christian God. So he first became a henotheist, and then he realized that it's the Christian God, and at that point he became a Christian. Well, this leads to some important questions. The one that everybody asks, who knows anything about Constantine, who talks to me about Constantine, is, was this conversion genuine? Was this the real deal, or was he just kind of doing this to jump on the bandwagon, or because he had political motives, or like he thought Christianity would be useful for his rule, or did he really become a Christian or not? And there are several reasons for questioning it. One is that after he became a Christian, he continued to use pagan imagery on his coins. So Roman emperors would issue coins. And, we don't do this anymore, so, we still have George Washington instead of Donald Trump on our quarters. But it used to be you'd put the emperor on, whoever the new emperor is. You'd issue new coins. And he continued, after he was a Christian, putting Sol Invictus, Apollo, on his coins. Well, he wouldn't do that if he was a Christian, would he? Also, he sure didn't behave like a Christian. Some rather interesting examples. When he became, after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, when he was trying to deal with the fact that there were other emperors in the world, he actually had his 10-year-old nephew executed. He executed his 10-year-old nephew because his nephew was the son of one of the other emperors, and he didn't want him to get into power. Well, that's not very Christian. Much later, he had his own son, his eldest son, Crispus, executed. And Crispus's mother and his own wife, Faustus, executed. He executed his wife. This is kind of a gruesome tale. Crispus was executed in some kind of normal way. Faustus was executed by being placed in a steam bath and having it overheated till she died. Cooked her to death, yeah. So the other thing that people wondered about, Constantine died in the year 337. He didn't get baptized until he was on his deathbed. If he was really a Christian, wouldn't he get baptized? Those are the questions. So they sound kind of, since the 19th century, there have been scholars saying, look, he wasn't really a Christian, he was just putting it on. And these are the reasons they think. My own view is, I think it's kind of the majority view of this these days, is that in fact, even though these are problematic, they really don't indicate that he wasn't a Christian. The pagan imagery on his coins, remember I pointed out that he came to think that Sol Invictus was the Christian god. So he continues using Sol Invictus because he thinks that's the Christian god. So I don't think that that's a particular problem. The idea about not behaving as a Christian, it's a little bit hard to say that if somebody doesn't behave like a Christian, they can't be a Christian. How many Christians would there be in the world? It's like, and if you're the Roman emperor, you can't rule the Roman Empire on the basis of the Sermon on the Mount. You just wouldn't last. Turn the other cheek. Are you kidding me? You're the emperor. You can't do that. And sometimes you may have noticed, sometimes Christians do bad things, and he did some bad things. The deathbed conversion is the least convincing of the arguments to begin with, because many people didn't get baptized until they were on their deathbeds. The reason is because the New Testament says that if you convert and become a follower of Christ, but then lapse into sin later, you're in danger of losing your salvation. Hebrews 6, the book of Hebrews chapter 6, verses 4 through 6 actually says that you will lose your salvation if you revert to sin. Well, if hell's to pay, literally, you don't want to do that. So you wait till your deathbed so there's no more chance to sin. And that's what people did. So, right. Next big question, was Constantine's conversion the key to the success of Christianity? It certainly didn't hurt Christianity, and it made Christianity licit. What happened with Constantine is when he converts in 312. Soon after, he meets up with the major emperor in the east, Licinius, and they hammer out an agreement that brings tolerance of all religion. It's the first edict that gave tolerance of all religions in the Roman Empire, including Christianity. This is called the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan. It's misnomered. It actually wasn't an edict, and it wasn't delivered in Milan. But they call it the Edict of Milan because they had this meeting in Milan. They came to this agreement, and Licinius sent out this letter to all the governors saying that every religion is acceptable, everybody should worship the way they want to, Christians, pagans, everybody, everything is okay. And that made it possible not to worry about the persecution anymore. So that helped, and so I don't think it was the key because, as I said, the way it's growing at this point, it's probably going to take over anyway. If Constantine hadn't converted, maybe another emperor would have because of the numbers, but it certainly didn't hurt. Did Constantine make Christianity the official state religion? This is widely believed, and it is completely wrong. Constantine did not make Christianity the state religion of Rome. He didn't. He made it an acceptable religion. It wasn't until the end of the 4th century that an emperor made Christianity the state religion. As we're going to see here in a minute, it's Theodosius I who did this 60 years after Constantine. It wasn't during the reign of Constantine. So no, he did not make Christianity the state religion. All right, the new Christian empire. You have now a Christian emperor, and what happens next? First, let me say something about church and state under the Christian emperor. Throughout all of history, there had been no separation of church and state. The very idea of separation of church and state made no sense to people in the ancient world. It was in a nonsensical category. In the ancient world, they didn't have separate words for politics and religion. There were no words for what we think of as religion or for what we think of as politics, let alone separate words. And they were closely connected because it was widely understood that the gods had made Rome great. So of course Rome sponsors the worship of the gods. It's not just a political act or just a religious act, it's both at the same time sponsoring the worship of the gods. It had always been that way. And when a Christian became the emperor, it continued to be that way. One of the things that Constantine did is he started bestowing benefits on the church. So the clergy, instead of being arrested and thrown in jail because they weren't sacrificed, now are given positions of prominence. They're given property. They're actually given land. And they're given money to build churches. And they start building major cathedrals in major cities. And they become influential, powerful people in their communities. And so Constantine starts showering benefits on the church. And of course, that doesn't hurt conversion rates because people realize now that's a good thing to be a Christian. You know, you don't have to worry about being persecuted. It's a favored religion. He got directly involved with Christian controversies. Directly involved with Christian controversies. The most important of which was the Arian Controversy. This is a controversy that's widely misunderstood by people today, in large part because so many people have gotten their knowledge of church history from that inestimable authority, Dan Brown, author of the Da Vinci Code. And according to the Da Vinci Code, what the Arian controversy was all about was whether Jesus was the Son of God. And so in the Da Vinci Code, Constantine calls the Council of Nicaea to decide whether Jesus was the Son of God, and in the end, it was a close vote. Yeah, it's completely bogus. Completely bogus. So the Arian controversy, let me just say a word about it. The Arian controversy is named after a leader, a teacher of the Church of Alexandria, Egypt, a very large church of Alexandria, Egypt, named Arius, A-R-I-U-S, Arius. Arius was trying to figure out how to explain the relationship of God the Father and God the Son. At this point in Christian history, every Christian knew that Jesus was the Son of God. This is not a decision that was being made. Christians had thought this for centuries at this point. Ever since the New Testament, everybody thought Jesus was the Son of God. The question is, if Jesus is the Son of God, how does he relate to God the Father? He's obviously his Son, but in what sense is he also God? In what sense is he also God? Everybody thought he was God, but in what sense is he God? Arius' solution was this. Arius said that in eternity past, way back in eternity, before anything else existed, just God existed, and God brought into being his Son. He begot a Son. Christ came into existence. Christ was a secondary divinity, a subordinate divinity, not equal in power and glory and majesty to the Father because he's the Son. He's not the Father. The Father is superior to the Son. Christ, the Son, then created the universe, and he eventually came into the world as a human being and died for the sins of the world, was raised from the dead, returned to heaven, and is God. But he's a subordinate divinity who came into being at a certain point of time. Well, that made sense to a lot of people, and still probably makes sense to a lot of people, because what's the option? I mean, if he's totally equal with God, then that would mean that he can't be almighty because God would be almighty, but if God's almighty and he's almighty, how does that work? You can't have two almighties. If two people are almighty, neither one of them is almighty, right? So it doesn't, and so that was Arius' view, and the opposite view was just the opposite, which said, wasn't just the opposite, it was different. The other view was Christ always existed. There never was a time when Christ did not exist. There never was a time when Christ did not exist, and he's not subordinate to God, he is equal with God. He is fully equal with God, the same substance as God, completely equal in every way. This side could argue that Christ always had to exist for a kind of a logic philosophical reason, which is this. If something changes, it either becomes more or less perfect. Right? It changes. So it either gets better or worse. So it changes. God cannot become the Father, because if he becomes the Father, he changes. And he's changed either for the better or for the worse. So he either was worse before or worse after, but he can't be worse than anything because he's perfect. So if God cannot become the Father, that means he always was the Father, which means the Son always existed. All right, so the other side argued Christ always existed and he was fully equal with God in every way. They argued it out. It was splitting the church. It may seem like splitting hairs to us. It seemed like splitting hairs to Constantine. Constantine, on record, said he found this argument tremendously trivial. He thought it didn't matter. But the church was split over this. And there were like people fighting in the street over this. And so he wanted to unify the situation. And so Constantine called the Council of Nicaea. Nicea, the Council of Nicaea, in the year 325 to resolve the issue. Over 300 bishops came in from around the world, leading thinkers of the Christian church. They argued the matter out over a period of time. They ended up taking a vote. It was not a close vote. The vote that won was against Arius. It was the side that won is that Christ has always existed and he's equal with God, not subordinate to God, and that became the official view. That was the Council of Nicaea. Constantine had no idea what he was getting into. I mean, he was a general. He was a bloodied general. He wasn't a philosopher. But he organized this council, he ran this council, and he went along with the decision of this council, which again shows he really was a sincere Christian. I mean, he might not have understood all the philosophical depth, but he was deeply involved in theological debates. The family of Constantine down to Julian the Apostate. Well, in fact, I'll take it beyond Julian the Apostate. After Constantine, every emperor of the Roman Empire was Christian. Every emperor was Christian after Constantine, except for his nephew Julian. After Constantine died, his son Constantius II became emperor, which created a certain problem actually for Christian theology, because Constantius II, his son, sided with Arius. And most people then became Arian for about 40 years. And so it kind of went from there. Eventually, the side that won at Nicaea became victorious again at the end of the 4th century and became the standard view. Julian, the apostate, is called that because Julian, the nephew of Constantine, started out as a Christian but converted back into paganism and wanted to make the empire pagan again. He ruled between the years 361 and 363. He died very young after a rule of only 19 months. And maybe for Christianity, it's a good thing he died because he wasn't able to do much. But if he had reigned for 60 years or something, no telling what would have happened to Christianity. A big change came at the end of the 4th century with the rule of Theodosius I, ruled 379 to 395. Theodosius was a very gung-ho Christian, and he's the one who, in effect, made Christianity the official religion of Rome. By this time, nearly half the empire was Christian, and he started passing legislation outlawing paganism. He shut down temples throughout the empire. He made it illegal to sacrifice animals to pagan deities. He made it illegal to worship gods in your household. Now, these laws, again, it's not like there are federal laws that everybody has to obey. These laws are being sent out to one area, one province, one place or another, but there are a lot of these laws going out, and it's affecting things. He basically makes it so that only Christianity is the legal religion, and he starts passing legislation against pagans and against Jews. Jews are being legislated against to the point where such laws as any Anybody who's a Christian who converts to Judaism will not be able to leave a will, and his property will be confiscated. All of his property will be confiscated. If a Christian marries a Jew, it's equal to committing adultery and is punishable as an act of adultery. So he starts past. Jews are no longer allowed to build synagogues or even repair synagogues. So it's anti-Jewish legislation and anti-pagan legislation as Christianity begins to be legislated as the official religion. This led to a period of Christian intolerance. I don't know any other word for it. Christians, of course, had always insisted that they were right and everyone else was wrong, but now they have political power. And they start using the power. This Christian intolerance is not so much evident at the imperial level that the emperor, there's some things that the emperor is doing that affect paganism, like his laws. What's really happening more often is that people on the ground realize that the authorities are going to turn a blind eye to whatever they do. And Christian mobs are attacking pagan temples and attacking pagan priests and defacing statues. One of the common things Christians like doing is taking a statue of the god and lopping off its hands and its ears and its mouth and its taking out its eyes in order to show that the pagan gods can't do anything. They can't see, they can't hear, they can't speak, they can't act, they lop off their genitals because they can't provide fertility, and so they're mutilating, destroying idol temples and idol statues and temples. And it leads to Christian intolerance that continues on down then through the ages. And so we have a bold new world. It is very interesting that when Christians were being persecuted, the Christian intellectuals were pleading for tolerance. Now, Christian intellectuals are pleading with the emperor to wipe out the pagans, literally to kill them, to kill the pagans. The pagan intellectuals now are pleading for tolerance. And so the shoe has gone on the other foot, and of course it has never returned. Was Christianity a triumph? Well, certainly, if you ask which religion won in the ancient world, it's Christianity. Christianity won out. It did. It won. It became the dominant religion of the West. That's a triumph. Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Well, it's probably a matter of taste. My taste is that it was both. Like probably almost all of you, I am very, very grateful for the cultural heritage that we have. The art, the literature, the music. I'm grateful for the history of Western thought, for philosophy, for all of these things. Something would have happened, of course, in history, but what we've inherited is directly tied to the Christian tradition. You know, it's not that Mozart himself, of course he was influenced by Christianity, but it's not like he was obsessed with Christianity. That's the only thing he's thinking about when he's composing his music. But you can't understand Mozart if you don't understand the history of music before that. And without the Christian tradition, it would have been completely different. Or Michelangelo, or just pick Milton. So there would have been other Mozarts and Michelangelos and Miltons, but they would have been incalculably different. So I'm grateful for the culture that we've inherited. I'm also cognizant of the fact that so much was lost. So much art destroyed. Those statues, those buildings destroyed by Christians. Or what often happened is they would take pagan temples and they would convert them into Christian churches, thereby destroying their architectural integrity. Literature. Hundreds of authors whose writings must have been extremely valuable that simply were never reproduced or even destroyed that we've lost. We've lost a lot. We've gained a lot. Was Christianity a triumph? Well, in many ways it was a triumph. In many ways it was a loss. It's probably both things at the same time. What's clear is that this was a major historical and cultural transformation. It's the one that I would say was the most important in the history of the West. Thank you very much. About 10 minutes for questions, yes.
Where do countries like Armenia and Georgia fit in the early?
Where do countries like Armenia and Georgia fit in this whole thing? Armenia is usually understood to be the first country actually to convert to Christianity before the Roman Empire did. And Georgia, there was a Christian movement in Georgia, but I don't really know very much about the history of Georgian Christianity. Yes?
Is that the first time the Jews have been persecuted? It's just kept coming.
Was that the first time Jews have been persecuted? Yeah, so the deal is, it's a very interesting study, how, the history of Jewish persecution. Jews really were not persecuted for being Jews before the Christian persecutions of Jews. Jews were sometimes opposed in the Roman Empire, or more commonly, actually, the Romans sometimes made fun of Jews, but because of their weird habits, their customs and their traditions, they were like, "You're doing what to your baby boys? You what?" It's like, the kosher food laws, and so they made fun of these things. But they made fun of Egyptians too, and they made fun of Ethiopians, and they made fun of anybody who wasn't a Roman, basically a Greek or Roman. If you're not a Greek or Roman, they make fun of you. So they were made fun of, but they weren't different from others that way. They were never persecuted because they were Jewish. There were several Jewish uprisings in Israel against Romans that the Romans put down and destroyed the temple and such, but that was because of that was the military action against the Romans that they were reacting to. They weren't persecuting Jews for being Jews. It's really not until you get to Christianity that you have opposition to Jews for being Jews. If you want to read a book about this, I think a really good study of this is James Carroll's book, Constantine's Sword, which talks about how the conversion of Constantine leads then to these horrible acts of persecution through the years.
Didn't you say Constantine's mother was Hellena?
Yeah, so Constantine's mother is Hellena, who of course then later visits the Promised Land and visits Israel. And the rumor is that she discovered the relics of the cross, and that's a later rumor, that wasn't historical. And she also didn't start the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but she did start the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem and the Church of the Ascension in Jerusalem. Yes, in the back.
Is there anything, when you talked about the cross and the symbol of the cross and sort of said the symbol of the fish maybe wasn't that important, anything to the idea that Christianity was more pacifistically inclined for the first 3 centuries and then made more militaristic?
Oh, that's an interesting question. How pacifistic was Christianity in the first century? And right. And in terms of the fish, when you said that, it made me remember, I'm not sure everybody knows about what that symbol of the fish was all about, drawing the fish. So the deal with the symbol of the fish is, it was a symbol. They did do the symbol of the fish, and it's just that, it wasn't how they were detecting each other and stuff. But the reason for fish is because the Greek word for fish is ichthus. And the letters, if you take the letters of ichthus, and it's the first letter of the words, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, in Greek. Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. You take the first letter of that saying, and it spells ichthus, spells fish, and that's why it's the symbol of the fish. So that's why it's the symbol of the fish. Right, but were Christians pacifists? There were Christians who were members of the Roman army, and there were debates about whether they could serve or not. The debates had less to do with whether it was okay to kill somebody in battle, and more to do whether it would require worshiping the army, the gods of the army, the Roman gods of the army, that you'd have to compromise your religious commitments that way. It was less about whether it's okay to and so different Christians, the side that was most vocal about it said you shouldn't serve in the army. The soldiers should not serve. Christians.
When did the cross appear as a symbol?
When did the cross appear as a symbol? Yeah, that's an interesting question. In early Christian art, the earliest art, like in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, you don't have the cross represented as a symbol for Christianity at all. And so like pictures of Jesus, You don't have pictures of Jesus on the cross in the early Christian art. What you have are pictures of Jesus, say, as a good shepherd, carrying a sheep over his shoulders. And the reason is because, I mean, everybody knew what the cross was, and this is like the last thing you want to associate with something religious. I mean, it's like, you know, it's like going around with the electric chair around your neck. It's like, what? And it's like, you know, and so it wasn't until the 4th century that you start getting the cross. And I don't know how influential the labarum was and all that, the Constantine's cross. I don't really know. I haven't looked into that too much. But the first time you start getting Christian art with showing Jesus and the cross is, I think it's in the 4th century. Yeah. Yes?
Was the Council of Nicaea was where the Trinity idea was developed?
The Council of Nicaea was not where the Trinity was developed. The Council of Nicaea is where they decided the relationship of the Son and the Father. After they decided that, then they started saying, well, what about the Spirit? And does that count too? The idea of a Trinity had been around for a long time. So the church father Tertullian uses the phrase Trinity back around the year 210 or so. So it had been around for over 100 years, but the doctrine of the Trinity is a specific way of trying to understand the relationship of the three. The doctrine of the Trinity that it finally emerges in the 4th and 5th century controversies is that the Trinity is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that those three are all completely equal. They are of the same substance. There are 3 persons in the Trinity, but there's only one God. So there are not 3 gods, there's one God, but that one God is not one person, it's 3 persons. And the doctrine of the Trinity insists that if you can understand that, you misunderstand it. Because it's a mystery. It's not something that can logically make any sense. But the 3 are one and the 1 are 3. And so any analogy you come up with ends up erring on the side of saying there's 3 or saying there's 1 when there's, yes?
Didn't the Roman emperors assume some kind of divinity or?
Did the Roman emperors assume some kind of divinity? Before Christianity, going back to the first Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus, when Caesar Augustus was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE. And his son at the time, his adopted son was named Octavian. And Octavian became his heir and inherited his massive fortune and had the Senate declare that Julius Caesar had been taken up into heaven. And if you're taken up into heaven, you're made a divine being. So Octavian made sure that they passed that decree, and it wasn't politically innocent that he did that, because if his father was God, what does that make him? Right? So he now is the son of God, and so that helps his political fortunes. And from then on, there developed an idea that when the emperor died, he was taken up into heaven and became a divine being. Only a few of the emperors insisted on being called divine during their lifetime. But that was certainly something that was going on, that when the emperor died, they'd be declared God. So I develop all that in this book of mine that I wrote called How Jesus Became God, where I talk about how that Jesus becoming God relates to all of that. I have time maybe for one more, if there is.
Balcony.
Yes. Balcony. Yes, thank you very much. Yes, please.
Hi there. How soon after Theodosius was the church established? The formal Vatican, maybe?
Yeah. So how far after Theodosius was the formal church established? I would say probably it's established during his day. It's already become a very authoritative institution. Theodosius had a run-in with the Bishop of Milan in Italy, Ambrose, who in a public setting reprimanded him and put him down and forced him to recant on a particular issue and told him that if he didn't, he wouldn't serve him communion, which meant he'd lose his salvation. And Theodosius backed down. So the church already is establishing power that at times is actually more powerful than the emperor already then. Let me close. I just wanted to take a final minute. Some of you know about the blog that I have, and if you don't, I want to tell you about it. I have a blog. So just go on the internet, look for the Bart Ehrman blog, and you will see it. This blog is something I've been doing for 5.5 years. I post 5 or 6 times a week, 1,000 words a day, on everything having to do with early Christianity. Historical Jesus, Paul, persecution, martyrdom, role of women, the formation of the canon, how we got the New Testament, the texts and manuscripts of the New Testament, the books that didn't make it into the New Testament, the Emperor Constantine, I mean, just everything. So 5 or 6 times a week, you get these 1,000-word posts. The only thing about this is you've got to pay to join. So it costs $24.95 for an annual membership, but I don't keep a penny. I give it all to charity. And so this is a way for me to raise money for charities dealing with hunger and homelessness. And so this last year we raised $120,000, and I'd like to raise a lot more. And for that, you need to join. And the thing is, it's not much. It's like, it's like 50 cents a week. And so you get a ton for your money, and it goes to a good cause. So look up Bart Ehrman blog and think about joining. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.